rooms to come down to. I'm from the University of Canberra, so I'm only just up the road, and so we don't have a huge geology department. There's just Dwayne White and me. So every now and then I will come down to RSES and watch a few little presentations. And this is the first opportunity I've had to actually present to you guys. So it's a nice close-knit group today. So I'm a marine geologist, and more specifically, I work on the geochemistry of sediments around Antarctica, focusing on beryllium isotopes. And we'll just go back to some general concept of how this is a useful tool to use. So these here are sediment particles, and these sediment particles can then be introduced to a water body or, for example, an ocean. The ocean isn't just one homogeneous massive H2O, as you can probably assume. There's a whole bunch of different atoms and other atoms within it, and different isotopes of those same atoms. And they, depending on their particle reactivity, attach themselves to these particles. They then become situated within these like ferromanganese crusts of those sediments, which can be readily accessed if you apply an acid to them. They'll be leached away. And this is what we call an orthogenic phase. And this means that that's basically storing or a production of a phase of sediment at the place where it was deposited, rather than being transported there, like what happens with those gray sediment particles. So that leads us to be can make it very useful. So if you have these distinct signatures in that water mass, they can become stored in these crusts. And so if we can measure those different isotope ratios, we can get an idea of how the oceans have changed. And the way we do that is by using sediment cores. So if you take a series of samples through the sediment core, those samples will be getting older and older as you get further down in depth. And if there's any variation in these isotope ratios or different signatures that you're interested in, or any other proxies that may be biological, then you can start interpreting different or changing environments of the area that is of interest. So beryllium-10 is the one that I'm specifically interested in. It's interesting because it has a kind of unique mode of production. So beryllium-10 is produced when cosmic rays enter the atmosphere. They interact with oxygen or nitrogen atoms, causing them to break apart. That produces a bunch of other minor particle components, as well as beryllium-10. This mostly happens in the upper atmosphere, and then it gets reworked in atmospheric circulation, and then through wet or dry deposition, it will make its way to the Earth's surface. This means of accessing the continent, especially around Antarctica. Oh, sorry, I'm jumping. This is usually used in tandem with 9Be. Now, beryllium-9, which is its stable isotope form, that form comes from the crust. So when erosion, weathering happens and puts it into the environment, that's where beryllium-9 comes from. But because concentrations are often susceptible to a range of different effects, not just its environment, you want to normalize against something. And so long as the beryllium-9 flux to that location stays relatively constant, you can use that to normalize against some of those effects. So I'll generally be talking about the beryllium-10-9 ratio here. So around Antarctica, beryllium has especially been becoming more and more popular in the last 10 or so years. And that's because a lot of different papers have shown that there's this increase in the beryllium-10-9 ratios sometime during the Holocene. Which has meant that, if there's a dramatic change in that signal, what could that then be indicating? And there have been generally two conceptual models about how this is working. The first is it's used as an exposure proxy. So if it's produced in the atmosphere and it settles down towards the continent, areas that are covered, and this is a marine environment, will prevent beryllium from accessing the sediments beneath it. Whereas areas that are uncovered, like an open, so that's beneath an ice shelf in the setting of Antarctica. Whereas areas that are uncovered should be relatively enriched in the beryllium 10-9 signatures. Following on from that concept, though, researchers like Valletta came along. They said, well, if beryllium's settling onto the continent, it's then being captured by the ice sheets. And so during phases of intense melt, you should have a substantial amount of beryllium-10 being released at the same time. So the question became, can this be used as a meltwater proxy? And this is something that has been, this is an application that has been used repeatedly in the last 10 or so years. And so then Dwayne came along and looked at the Amery Ice Shelf system, and he looked at the beryllium isotope signatures from underneath the Amery Ice Shelf, as well as the open marine environment. And what he found is that the concentrations, at least, of beryllium-10 seemed quite significantly affected by bottom currents, or currents acting in the system, sweeping beryllium-10 atoms underneath the ice shelf, which are then becoming deposited. And whereas in outflow areas, it's relatively depleted in those signatures. However, what he asserted was that the beryllium 10-9 ratio would be a better representation of environment, or that exposure that I was talking about before. So he was basing his interpretations off this initial exposure hypothesis. However, if we go to a different system as another example, this is my work from my PhD, and if we used Bellingshausen Sea, I took a series of samples from the open marine environment as well as a sub-ice shelf site just there. So this is George VI ice shelf. And so if you're expecting the exposure proxy hypothesis to be working, then you'd expect there to be quite a substantial difference in the beryllium 10-9 ratios between those two environments. And what we see is that the sub-ice shelf, which is in purple, and the immediate outflow site, which is quite a substantial distance away from the ice shelf front, is effectively the same. So if you were to try and compare those two points back in time, you wouldn't be able to differentiate the environment from that. So it doesn't look like that's working. But if we move on to the meltwater pulse hypothesis, then a similar process of logic applies. So if we're looking at the area where there's outflow, or underneath the ice shelf, you'd expect there, or the expectation is that there would be more melt, and therefore those signatures may be higher, which is something that we also don't see in this specific system as well as others. So it doesn't look like that hypothesis is also working. So during my PhD, I went away and tried to come up with another way in which beryllium might be getting to the continent. And what came back to kind of Dwayne's paper, where circulation is clearly moving stuff around. So looking at the areas where beryllium is most deposited, which is up here, it follows these rain belts, but this is happening at mid-latitudes rather than towards the pole. So it's actually relatively, what's coming down on the Antarctic continent is actually relatively little in comparison to more northern areas. And so if that's coming down there, then those beryllium atoms will then get swept up in the global ocean circulation and make their way to the Antarctic continent. So eventually. And so some of these water masses, like specifically circumpolar deep water, will then could then be driving beryllium concentrations on the continental shelf. And so if we look at the Bellinghausen Sea again, what we see is in areas where you have inflow of these upwelling processes, those ratios are relatively high in comparison to what is beneath the ice shelf and where you'd expect melt to be highest. So it looks like at this stage this is working. This was a relatively qualitative approach, at least a qualitative relationship approach that was proposed. And there's still a lot more work into refining the proxy in this method, but at this stage it looks like one of the more reliable means of its utility. So this brings us to the Denman region. So we know that circumpolar deep water is accessing a continental shelf in the Denman region. And so Dwayne went off and he selected a drill site from beneath Shackleton Ice Shelf and used a hot water drill to drill a hole through it. And he got CTD profile and a core from that. And from all his work, we can see that there is a heavily modified version of circumpolar deep water where we are looking at underneath the Shackleton Ice Shelf. And from that, I wanted to measure this core for beryllium isotopes to see if there was any change. And what I found was relatively disappointing in some ways because it looks like there is no change. And so it doesn't look like there's substantial evidence for changing conditions at the specific location in the Shackleton Ice Shelf, beneath Shackleton Ice Shelf. That could mean that these modern circumpolar deep water conditions have stayed relatively static throughout the course of the deposition of this core, or it could mean something else. But having just one core also lacks a little bit of context. So a lot of you would have seen this bit of data before from me. So I want to show you a little bit of the new data that I have. So I took an approach like I did with my paper where I showed you the Bellinghausen Sea. I looked at a spatial data set of sediment core tops rather than a series of temporal or down core sections. And they're from a range of different environments. So there's the continental slope, the outer shelf, the mid shelf, the inner shelf, and then the sub-ice shelf core. And I measured the beryllium isotopes from all of these different sites. Now, the sampling efforts of this was largely to look at this area, and that was a concentration of sampling effort from both the Germans, the EASY 1 and 2 voyages, from where these data that I'm working with come from, as well as the Denman Marine voyage. And that's because we're suspecting that there's substantial amounts of circumpolar deep water and other things happening at this area. And we can see that again from all his work where there are these incursions in 2024 at least of this circumpolar deep water coming up onto the continental shelf in this area. So if we're going to kind of try and figure out what we might expect if that is the main pathway of CDW coming into the Denman region, then we might expect a kind of trend like this from the open marine on the left all the way to the sub-ice shelf on the right. A general decreasing trend in the beryllium 10-9 ratios. And what we see, these are all the data. And then these are just those averages of those key points. And what we see is that the slope has the highest, which is what you might expect, but then there is an approximate decreasing trend inland. However, it is confounded by kind of these 2 points where the outer shelf, which you'd have expected to be, as pretty close to the slope concentrations, is lower than the mid shelf or inner shelf in its ratios, which was very surprising to me. And it indicates that other processes are likely at play here. And it made me ask the question first, is this red arrow the dominant pathway for circumpolar deep water? Or are there alternative pathways that may be the the main one that's in effect that is then being stored in these sediments? So what I wanted to then do was go away. We've got a whole bunch of observational ocean data from this region. So I've worked with Ulla on uh, this part where I was interested in seeing whether or not you could relate the beryllium-10 ratios in the sediments to the observational ocean data that we have from CTDs, looking at near bottom temperature or near bottom salinity in the first instance. And what we see a reassuring trend is the first interpretation that I have from these data. However, there's still a substantial amount of spread, especially in those in that middle bracket, which is representing that outer shelf versus inner shelf environment. And I'm not 100% sure. Oh, well, yeah, it's trending in the right direction, but there's substantial spread. But the cores themselves are not. When I'm sampling a core, it's unlikely that I'm sampling a specific snippet in time. I'm sampling, 5 millimeters of sediment, which may represent decades to centuries in time if, everything that was in the overloading water column was effectively stored in that sample. And then I'm trying to compare this to CTD data that's taken on a single day, on a single season of a single year, which is likely, it could be a warm year or it could be a cool year. And it means that that's likely not the most effective means of comparison with the oceanography of this region. So what I want to do is I would like to test this against some of these time average global or regional ocean models. Now, this is something that I've discussed so far with a few colleagues from ACEAS, and it's data I'm working on accumulating with them that I can then look at. But that is going to be the next phase of this kind of project. So these are all the people who I'd like to thank for helping me with this data collection, all these conversations, and the models and the other data. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Any questions?
I do have a question. Oh, two questions. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. It's very, I love when people get data from proxies, different those things. If I understood correctly, you get by the dynamics two signals coming from the area. One could be the meltwater, and the other one they think that is most likely is the spin depth, right? When I saw your plots of temperature and saline varying rates, I see that whenever you have like cooling, you have fresh and we have like warming, you have a salinification of these waters. To make me think that maybe you have a little bit of a mix of both. So I was wondering if there is a little bit of a way of separating the melt signal, maybe using oxidizer or something like that.
That's a good question. Yeah, I haven't collected any oxygen isotope data to try and differentiate those two, but that would be a really good idea. Yeah, yeah. Yes, and I wonder whether there could be like localized effects of melt. I don't think that's going to be like the broad spectrum primary influence across the region, at least from the data that I've been looking at so far. But it could be that like certain areas that get a lot of melt and not a lot of offshore waters may then also be largely reflecting a meltwater signal over an ocean signal. But yeah, I need to look at a bit more data for that.
Thank you.
Good question for you. You started out with kind of three possibilities as to what might happen with the 10-9 ratio, and they all started out. Is that kind of surprising?
The atmospheric hypothesis and the meltwater one. So when I started my PhD, I expected the atmospheric hypothesis to be working. So yes, I was quite surprised in the initial instance. But are you talking about the Denman region? Yes, that was surprising. I thought that, like in most other areas that I've looked at, and I've looked at 5 or 6 different ice shelf open ocean systems around Antarctica, most of them have adhered to this kind of primary upwelling current trend in the beryllium 10-9 ratios. However, here in the Denman, that doesn't look like it's not as robust, but it's not working in the way that I thought it would. And so I think we need a little bit more context to that to then actually say what exactly is driving those signatures in the sediments. It may still be one of those hypotheses. It's just that we don't have the data to show that explicitly yet.
So what do you need to be able to answer the question?
I think the models are probably the first line that I want to go down, because that's time averaging. At least my understanding from the models, and I'm not a modeler, is that it can time average these processes over longer periods of time that are then getting stored in the sediments. So we can just look at the temperature and salinity, but we can also look at, say, putting a dye into these models and seeing if there's a concentration of these upwelling pathways in certain areas versus the areas where, say, my beryllium 10 signals are relatively deficient. But that's the first line that I want to go to. But actually, Wilton's suggestion of looking at different isotopes is a really good one. How do you get the seawater sample from underneath? So the sample from George the I think it's George the 6th actually. That's from a different campaign. That's with colleagues from the British Antarctic Survey. And the other samples from that study that I showed were from various Polarstern voyages that happened through time. They were archived samples there, Carl. Jackie, how does hey Jackie, I have so Jackie's asking about how it relates to bathymetry. I'm not sure yet, but that's a really good point. I talked a little bit with Marty McNeil, who was on EZ3 and collected some of that bathymetry data, but I haven't looked at the bathymetry in detail yet. So that's going to be added to the list of things to do. It's probably time for one more or two more questions. Otherwise, we can get Wilton to start early.
I guess I've got a question about the time scale that you can look at with this beryllium data. Is there sort of a limit on how far back you can go in the past?
Yes, but not on these kind of Holocene last glacial maximum timescales. So the half-life of beryllium 10 is 1.5-ish million years. So it's really, as long as you can correct it, it's good for several million years at least, potentially. But for the most part, I'm largely interested in, the last 10 to 100,000 years, which means that the effects of that decay are going to be relatively limited.
So you're generally most interested in the like sediment pulls from the seafloor for the first tens of meters or something?
That's been where my work has been focused. I would be interested to see what happens across the mid-Pleistocene transition, for example, but that's just work that I haven't got to yet, but it is something I am interested in doing. Cool. All right. Thank you, everybody. I think we'll set Wilton up now. Yeah. So yeah. I'll try to share it on the. Okay. Yeah. Can people see this?
We're sharing.
Okay, let people see this. Let's just put a timer here.
Awesome. Thank you everyone again for coming. For those who don't know me, I'm Wilton. I don't know where's the camera. I'm Wilton, and today I'll be presenting to you a work that I've been doing and finishing up here during my postdoc at ANU, it's called Reassessing the Role of the Antarctic Slope Current in the Polar Heat Transport. Now, as a context, I wanted to present a few features of the circulation of the coastal Antarctica first. And the first one that I want to present is, for those who don't know, which I imagine will be very little people, is the Antarctic Slope Current, which is this westward flowing current shown here in red, that kind of like separates the offshore waters from the continental shelf waters, and sits right on the top of the continental slope. Now, this geographical location of this current makes it a lot of people think that the strength of this current might be one of the regulators of the polar ocean heat transport towards the continental shelf, but there's very little actually research looking at this circumpolarly, and that's what we wanted to test in this research here. Now, first of all, why do we even care about the heat transport to Antarctica? That's a simple question, of course. The answer to that is because we know Antarctica shelf is melting, and Antarctica shelf kind of like constrains the melting of the ice sheet. So by melting more of the ice shelf, we can actually increase the rate of sea level rise. And one of the main mechanisms that generate this melting of the ice shelves, especially in West Antarctica, in some places in East Antarctica, it is basal melting. So it's just this inflow of heat for circumpolar deep waters coming to the ice shelves and interacting with them and melting them. So this is why I want to understand how this current plays a role in this mechanism. Now here on the right, I'm showing a transect, a schematic transect of this current to understand a little bit how it will be possible for this current to actually control the heat transport, right? So offshore, we see this circumpolar deep water here highlighted in red, some of the regions, and they are generally separated from the shelf by this like downward slope isopycnal slope. And right on the top of this isopycnal slope, and also as a response of this slope, we have this Antarctic slope current, which is geostrophically answering to the gradient of densities that we have between the shelf and offshore, right? Because of that, then people think that as this isopycnal slopes change, you will change also the flow of the circumpolar deep water to the shelf. And this has been highlighted in several studies before. I can pick up one of them, for example, that says the Antarctic slope current acts as a dynamical barrier between the shelf waters and the subpolar open ocean. Now, there are two mechanisms by which we can think about physically that this will happen. One will be that whenever we have the flattening of these isopycnals here, we then directly allow more circumpolar deep water to get to the shelf, but also this flattening of these isopycnals erases the density gradient between the shelf and offshore, which then makes the slope current decelerate. So it'll be more of a covariability, but not a causality in this case. The second dynamics that we could explain this correlation, or this perceived correlation between the slope current and the circumpolar deep water heat flux, it is through the eddy flow. And the idea is here that the stronger the current it is, it means that we need eddies to be more energetic and stronger to cross the strong barrier and then transport heat to the shelf. It's basically an analogy of like crossing a fast river. It's harder than crossing a babbling brook. However, those assumptions, they all rely in a picture of the hydrography of Antarctica that looks a little bit like the one here in the left, which is characteristic of some specific regions of Antarctica, but not all of them. As you can see, there are some regions of Antarctica, especially in West Antarctica, what we call the warm shells here, in which the isopycnals are actually going up the water column, and where circumpolar deep water have direct access to the continental shelf. So the idea of the isopycnal slope changing up and down might not be necessarily the case in that. We also have dense shelves where the isopycnals look completely different, like this V-shape type of structure, and where there's a lot of like interaction with dense waters overflowing that could invite circumpolar deep water towards the shelf. Which then raises the question on whether that assumption of the circumpolar deep water responding to the AC speed is actually valid circumpolarly, which is what we wanted to test in the study. And if there is a relationship with the type of isotopic structure and the regime of the shelf, which is what we wanted to test then in this study. So to do that, then we use simulations with ACEAS M201, which have been used before for several studies of the Antarctic slope current. And I'm showing here, for example, a study by Vilma, in which we can see that ACEAS M2 high resolution is capable to represent the slope of Antarctica, as highlighted here in red near the continental shelf. And also this is a long slope flow that is characteristic of the slope current. To then correlate this slope current with the polar heat transport, we needed to come up with a definition of this current. And what we did is we define it as their long slope velocities over the 1,000 meters isobath, which is kind of highlighted here in red. And we defined also the cross slope heat transport as the heat transport that is going towards the shelf perpendicular to this isobath in the same location then. So we can co-locate those two patterns. For this study, then we use a simulation with ACEAS M2 that uses interlinear forcing, so we can analyze time scale of covariability between those two patterns too. Finally, we decided to focus on the heat transport mostly of the circumpolar deep water, which generally is attributed as the main melter of the Antarctic ice shelves. Then for that, we needed to come up with a definition of circumpolar deep water. We decided to come up with a kind of an innovative definition, which is based on age. So basically, we know the circumpolar deep water derives from the North Atlantic deep water that is formed in the North Atlantic. And this age tracer in the model, they basically count the amount of time since this water has been ventilated. So the oldest waters in the Southern Ocean, as you can see here by this TS diagram in the yellow colors, becomes then associated with the circumpolar deep waters because they have only been ventilated in the North Atlantic. And we will separate the heat transport as a function of this age. We can see this peak in negative heat transport, which means poleward, right at the 95% oldest waters in the continental shelf. Hence, we define our circumpolar deep water as this 95 oldest or 5% oldest waters in the continental shelf and retain our analysis within this layer. We then did a precise correlation between the CDW heat transport and the speed using the interannual and seasonal climatology using daily data. Let's look at then the results. Okay, so this is our map for the determination coefficient between those two patterns. As you can see, each one of these bends along the continental slope where we did this calculation. On the top, we have the definition of the shelf regimes as I shown before. So the green one is the fresh regime, the purple one is the dense one, and the red one is the warm one. And the colors in each one of these beams represent the determination coefficient that we find for each one of these sites. The first thing that is striking is actually that you can see mostly very light colors around the slope, representing that there's likely not very much of a covariability between those two patterns as is assumed before. Now, the correlation tells me how strong these two patterns covary, but they don't tell us about the direction of this covariability. So for that, then we added the slope of this correlation that is shown here in the red and blue color bar, in which the blue one signifies that a weaker current allows more heat to come to the shelf. So directionally, we see that there's a lot of regions that actually agree with this idea of a weaker current allowing more heat to come to the shelf. But then we see that they don't vary that strong when we see the R squares. If we separate the regions with high R squares and the region with higher slopes, we come up with basically four specific sites that I'm listing here: the Mertz, the Glomar, the West Antarctic Peninsula, and just west of Filchner, which is actually striking because there says then the 75% of the continental slope doesn't have this strong correlation between the slope current and the cross slope heat transport as it has been suggested before. Now, more interestingly, if you see some of these regions, for example, Mertz and the region in Filchner, they are located in dense shelves, And Glomar, even though according to Thompson, it is not a dense shelf, in our model, it is a dense shelf because we have dense shelf water overflow. So a lot of these seasonal correlations, they happen mostly in dense shelf areas. And this has been highlighted before in a dynamic of the dense shelf water overflow as shown in this paper from Adele before, in which when the dense shelf water overflows in these canyons, it excites changes in sea surface height that then generates a geostrophic current that actually brings the Circumpolar Deep Water directly to the shelf, right? So it's the dynamics that have been highlighted before, but it's interesting that this seems to be the controller of the seasonal variability between these two patterns in our study. And not necessarily the one that we explained before in terms of the isopycnal slope. Now for the interranean variability. That's probably more interesting in terms of long-term melting of the Antarctic ice shelf, right? So this is the same map now for the R-squares for the interranean variability. What we see is that the color is actually even lighter, highlighting that we even have weaker correlation here. When we see the slopes of this regression, we see that also lighter values towards the white. So we see that actually less heat cross the shelf interraneally, even in sites where we have high correlation here. If we highlight the sites that have high correlation and high slopes, we identify three main sites, which is the West Antarctic Peninsula, Getz, and Glomar, which means that interraneally, 83% of the continental slope actually doesn't have this covariability between the slope current and the Circumpolar Deep Water heat transport, which is actually quite striking. Now, one thing that is useful to look at, though, is that in this case, each one of the sites of high covariability actually sits in a different shelf regime. So one is in the warm regime, one in the fresh, and one in our model's dense shelf regime. So we can look a little bit in each one of the sites to see what is directing this high correlation between these two circulation patterns, specifically the slope current and the cross slope heat transport. And that's what we decided to do to understand a little bit better on that. So for that, what we did then is to pick up each one of the sites and create composites, interranean composites for high speed and low speed regimes of the AC, and saw how the isopycnal structure changes and the temperature changes on the shelf in each one of those. So to start, I'm going to look at the warm regime in here, which is the one in the West Antarctic Peninsula, and that's the one that Circumpolar Deep Water has direct access to the shelf. So in here we have on the top the composites for a strong AAC, so a strong eastward flowing AAC, and the bottom is a composite for the weak AAC. The black lines in here shows, especially the top black line, it is the top of our Circumpolar Deep Water layer, as defined by our H definition, and the other line is the middle of our Circumpolar Deep Water layer. What we can see is that, very interesting is that in the strong ASC regime, we have this Circumpolar Deep Water layer actually going directly to the shelf and filling out the shelf completely, while when we have a weak circulation, the Circumpolar Deep Water layer then curls down again and it doesn't have direct access to the shelf. And this is aligned with the warming of the shelf too. So in this regime, the classic picture of a stronger ASC driving heat transport is what is shown for this eastward currents case. And this is actually logical because in this site, we have a eastward flowing AC that is directly an extension of the ACC that is carrying Circumpolar Deep Water through the continental shelf. For the second regime, then we have the fresh regime, which is the classic one that I explained before, in which we have the slope of the isopycnus curling down or going down the water column as we go towards the slope. And we have a westward flowing slope current. These are then in the top the composites for a weak slope current, and the bottom is the composites for the 10 years with the strongest westward flowing slope current. We can see here another interesting feature that has been documented before for the gates in observations, which is when we have a weak ASC, we have the appearance of this reversed undercurrent happening on the slope, right? And this reverse undercurrent then excites this warming on the shelf and this deeper entrance of the Circumpolar Deep Water towards the shelf. This might not be very easy to see in the isopycnose itself, but if we look at the time series of this current, we can see that very clearly. So this is the time series for the slope current velocity, with the pink values showing the dominance of the undercurrent, so the eastward flowing undercurrent, and the green values showing the dominance of the westward flowing current. And in the bottom here now we have the heat transport through the shelf. So the more red we have, or more negative, we have more heat going to the shelf. And we can see that whenever we have these peaks in eastward flowing current, we end up having also a lot of heat transport crossing the shelf and showing that actually this intermittent undercurrent is bringing circumpolar deep water directly towards the shelf. Finally, we have the example for the dense region, which is the one that we have this classic V shape in this isopycnal structure. And we also have a westward flowing slope current. In the top, then we have the composites for the weak ASE, and in the bottom is the composite for the strong slope current case. I don't know how it is there, but here in the, at least in the slides, in the room, it's not that easy to see, but it gets a little easier if we see the composite here. What we see here is the top of the ASE, or the top of the circumpolar deep water, the middle of the circumpolar deep water, and the bottom of the circumpolar deep water in each one of these cases. And in the case of the full isopycnose, this is the case that we have with the weak ASC. We have these isopycnose that limit the bottom of the circumpolar deep water reaching further down the slope, which is a diagnostic for a stronger overflow, actually. So we are actually catching in this composite periods of strong overflow in the weak ASC case and periods of weaker overflow of dense waters in the strong ASC case, right? What is interesting is like whenever we have the stronger overflow, we have this warming right on the top of the overflow, showing that circumpolar deep water is encroaching on the top of it and bringing heat. Now, what is interesting too is that this doesn't mean necessarily that we have a warming of the shelf, but that's because in this season we also have a lot of transformation water mass. So this heat actually is coming to the shelf, coming to the surface, exchanges with heat with the surface, and becoming the shelf water too. And this can be seen more clearly if we see the mass transport across the shelf break in this region. So in the blue line and the orange lines, we have the cumulatively transported mass transport from the bottom up. And the top peak here shows how much of dense water we are exporting from the shelf. And it's clear that in the weak ASC periods, we have much more dense shelf water exported to the shelf than in the westward case, which then closes our case of circumpolar deep water encroaching to the shelf whenever we have this dense shelf water overflows happening in this region. Now, even though these three regions have a very clear dynamics to explain, the other regions, we saw that there was not much of a correlation. I think that this is the most interesting thing, actually, because our study then highlights that over most of the continental shelf, 20% of the, or 80% of the continental shelf, we don't have a correlation between the slope current and the cross-slope heat transport. Specifically, this correlation only happened in a few sites for specific dynamics that are happening, which then tells us that we should be careful when assuming that a stronger current could act as a barrier to the flow of heat to the shelf. Now, I think I have to highlight a few biases in the study, or a few caveats in the case. One is that our model have no ice shelves, and we know the ice shelves can control the amount of heat that is coming from offshore to the shelf barotropically. We have no tide seal that can change the mixing. And we also have an eddy permitting model and not fully eddy resolving on the shell. But nevertheless, we still find an interest in this result, and we still find that people should be careful when assuming this correlation between these two patterns. Finally, this is a cooperative study that I did in here with participation of all these little faces in here. And I just want to acknowledge their participation in the study too. So that's why they're there. I think I went a little fast, but thank you. I can see questions here. Oh yeah, there are big questions. Oh, that's for Matt.
I have a question for you. The the vast majority of the mass loss is occurring in Pine Island and Thwaites, which didn't show up at all. So does that mean that the ASC is just not a factor that's causing most of the mass loss?
That's what we interpret from it. Like, the way that I see is that most of the mass loss that is being driven there is still from Circumpolar Deep Water, but that is not being mediated by the slope current. So other processes, for example, heat advection laterally could be important there, for example, or even maybe from surface waters.
So is someone in ACEAS studying those processes as well?
Not that I'm aware, probably.
Or did you think this was the cause and it turned out not?
Sorry?
Did you think that this was the main, was likely to be the main cause and it turned out not to be the case?
I think like the way they interpret is that we do have Circumpolar Deep Water driving a lot of melting there, but this is not mediated necessarily by our slope current. So other processes are going to be important in that. Does that make sense to your question or?
Not quite. I'm wondering why someone isn't studying the process that's causing greatest melting. Is it because we don't know what it is?
I imagine some people might be working on that observationally, but in modeling, I'm not aware who is looking at that specifically. Sorry. Yeah. So we have a question from Julia too. What does the on-shelf heat transport look like? I assume the heat transport onto the shelf happens only at some locations rather than everywhere around the slope. So do your regions that display correlation, are those coincident to those few locations that do have heat transport? Good question, Julia. We do have a lot of variability in the on-shelf heat transport there, which we dealt here by doing these 10-degree beams, because what happens, like we have a model with a specific grid, and depending on where we are locating this heat transport, we might have like the ASC bringing heat in some region and then meandering out of the shelf, for example, in other regions. So we end up having like this very noisy signal in the heat transport if we don't do those beams. Now, the way that we do those beams after looking at them is that most of them, they would have southward heat transport. Some of them will have higher variability than others, but these regions of high variability of heat transport, without taking into account the AC, are not the same regions where we have the higher correlations necessarily. So I guess I can answer in the questions. It's not the regions that have more heat transport, they are having the higher correlations in here. Ooh, I guess if you don't have more questions. Oh.
In regions without the correlation, you still make those composite plots. Just to see anything, or is it just like not much?
Yes, so good question too. We do look at it specifically for one of the regions which is Totten, because there are observational studies that actually look at that and find the temperature on the shelf changing as this slope current changes too. We actually do not find any correlation either with the heat transport in the region either, or with the actual temperatures on the shelf either. And that could be for a few reasons. It could be related specifically to the time scale in which this was measured and location in which this was measured in the observational record, which is much more restricted than what we would separate in the beams. It could be also because of the bathymetry that is used in the model, which I think it could be a possible bias too. If we have a deeper bathymetry in reality than in the model, we expect less heat to come, for example, for Circumpolar Deep Water. But we do look at some of the regions is actually quite consistent with the heat transport patterns that we find when we do this composite in the low correlation regions. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. I think we'll have another one in about 3 weeks.